They are correct that the ice core record generally shows that CO2 concentrations lag the temperature by several hundred years. The explanation is the CO2 wasn't the forcing of those changes in climate. Some other forcing that we've talked about already started those periods of warming, like the sun or the Earth's orbital wobble. First off, logically, that doesn't prove that CO2 can't or isn't acting as the forcing this time. It's the same as saying, my car has stopped many times before, but it's never been for lack of gas. Therefore, I must not now be out of gas, even though your gas gauge reads low. And the second hole in that objection is scary in itself. You see, the warmer a liquid is, the less gas will stay dissolved in it. That's why a glass of tap water left out overnight will have bubbles on the sides in the morning. When the water warms up to room temperature, it can't hold all the air that had been dissolved in it when it was cold. So some of the air comes out as a gas and sticks to the side. Well, CO2, along with all the other atmospheric gases, dissolves in the ocean. When something warms the ocean up a little bit, like the sun or the Earth's orbit, whatever, what happens to the amount of gas that gets to stay dissolved in the water? It gets less, which means that some of that dissolved CO2 that used to be in the water is now released into the atmosphere. And what does CO2 in the atmosphere do? It traps more of the sun's heat. Does this remind you of anything like a feedback cycle? The extra trapped heat warms the ocean more, releasing more CO2, which warms the globe and the ocean more, releasing more CO2, and etc., etc. So CO2 did not trigger the periods of warming we observe in the ice record. But through this feedback loop, it probably turned out to be the dominant factor in the eventual magnitude of the changes. So far from dismissing CO2 as a problem, this objection about CO2 lagging temperature actually emphasizes the power of a little CO2 through the feedback mechanism. And speaking of emphasizing, I want to use this misconception to emphasize that none of us should get too cocky about our abilities to understand climate science, perhaps the most complex topic of study in all human history. Think back to the video, The Nature of Science. Do you remember how easily fooled your common sense was? There's a reason that it takes a long time to get a PhD in these fields. As citizens, it is our role to essentially supervise those who are working for the greater good on our payroll, but we hired professionals for a reason. It's because the world is complex, and the scientists aren't as easily fooled as we are. For instance, remember this feedback demo? What would you expect to happen if, once the feedback loop is activated, I move the mic closer? Louder, right? Since there's less room for the energy to dissipate, so the output and therefore the input has higher amplitude? Watch. Now closer. Wild, huh? Totally unexpected. Guess why it does that? I have no idea. I don't know. But I'm going to have my physics class play with it and see what they can figure out. But I recommend not trying this experiment at home, especially with your planet. The Pentagon report I mentioned earlier cautions, quote, with at least 8 abrupt climate change events documented in the geological record, it seems that the questions to ask are, when will this happen? What will the impacts be? And how can we best prepare for it? Rather than, will this really happen? End quote. In his introduction to With Speed and Violence, author Fred Pierce quotes a climate scientist who said to him quietly, if we are right, there are really dire times ahead. End quote. If you recall, my whole point of this video project is not to convince you to believe such predictions, but simply to ask the question, why risk it? Where is the value in ignoring such warnings from so many smart, experienced, credible people working in their field? 10 years ago, before I learned the details of global climate change, I lumped it in with all the other environmental causes. But once I learned the specific mechanics, evidence, and scope of the issue, things changed dramatically. I distinctly remember that one afternoon and that dreadful dawning sense of, oh my God, as the sheer scope and reach of the threat unfolded and fell together. I'd studied quite a bit of physics and chemistry by that point, and in that one afternoon, in that one chemistry lecture by that one professor, the puzzle pieces fell together with a crashing sense of awe. It transformed me. As I said earlier, I live in the Pacific Northwest in the US, and I love hiking in old-growth forests. I'm a literal tree hugger. I dig touching this huge living thing and imagining how it was there in that exact same spot, already old when the Declaration of Independence was signed, or when the Pilgrims landed, or even before horses came to the continent. It's just freaking amazing. But now, when I see clear cuts, I think, sweet, carbon sequestration. Let's get more trees planted so we can cut them down too. When a charity asks for money, I ask them back, what will it do to reduce carbon emissions? I'm even a booster for nuclear power now, the most reckless, irresponsible, short-sighted boondoggle ever. But it's carbon-free. I know I sound like a zealot, but this is entirely a pragmatic thing for me. It reminds me of an account I read recently by a Washington insider. He was speaking about how the sentiment on Capitol Hill about global climate change was slowly changing, as lawmakers, one by one, each had their own individual holy shit moment. But there are so many problems and only finite resources of time and money. Why start with climate change? I had a professor of chemistry, oceanography, and atmospheric sciences, smart guy, who put it this way: paper or plastic? Doesn't matter. Save the whales? Doesn't matter. Toxic waste? Save Social Security? Pro-life or pro-choice? Doesn't matter. If the worst of the possible consequences of global climate change come to pass, it will so dominate us as a species that every other conceivable issue will pale in comparison. That is why climate change is not just another environmental issue. This is not about whether you love Mother Earth or care for the whales or enjoy the idea of old-growth forests or the value of wildlands. This is the height of pragmatism. This is about preserving our standard of living in the face of potentially drastic changes that we ourselves have caused. Just why is climate change such a dominant issue? Well, look out your window. Climate is everywhere, every when. In the past, when we mucked someplace up, we could always move on to greener pastures. But when it's global, there's nowhere to run to, nowhere to hide. Part of what makes this all terrifying is not just the possibility of abrupt climate change, but how it's a complete mismatch for our threat survival system. Psychologist Daniel Gilbert wrote an excellent column in 2006 titled "If Only Gay Sex Caused Global Warming," where his basic point was, we evolved, if you believe in that, to react to what is immediately threatening. And that's worked great for us so far as a species. But now we find that we are threatened by something that instead is abstract and in the future. And we're just not wired to watch out for stuff like that. I guess that's why we're sitting in column B of our grid, little to no significant action, which is a frightening place to be when you realize what the stakes are, and that the odds seem to be heavily in favor of human-caused global climate change turning out to be true rather than false. I don't know about you, but that gets me really agitated. It's sort of like changing lanes on the highway to miss an unexpected obstruction in your lane. If you're vigilant and on your game, you see it far enough ahead that you can do what they told you in driver's ed. Remember? Smog. Signal, mirror, over the shoulder, go. So that you can change safely and smoothly to the other lane next to you. But if you're careless or distracted so that you don't see it until you're almost on top of the obstruction, all you can do is yank the wheel and hope to God no one's in the lane next to you. And that's the problem, because as a species, we're pretty much ADD. As a group, we're not looking down the road. We're just trying to make it through the next couple minutes. And to me, that's the most terrifying part of all of this. We're confident that we can get out of any pickle we need to, because our brilliant innovations, improvisations, and reactions have always fit the bill before. Maybe that's why the alarm bells haven't gone off. Our unconscious bias has been formed by our past successes, so that we can't imagine failing so spectacularly. But this time, it seems it will probably take something new for us to succeed. We will have to overcome our basic human nature of being reactive instead of proactive. That's a heck of a challenge. Years ago, I learned a lesson about looking ahead that has stuck with me, and I'd like to share it here. I grew up on a farm, a nursery technically. My dad grew ornamental plants in the ground, and sometimes it was my job to mow the grassy fields in between the plants. You'd want to get as close to the plants as possible without actually hitting them, in order to minimize the amount of hoeing you'd have to do by hand later. The problem was the plants were both delicate and expensive, so you'd really have to concentrate, especially because you were driving a medium-sized tractor fairly fast with this big mower hanging off the back that would swing out the opposite way when you turned. So if I was trying to nestle right into the row of plants to my right, I'd have to be extremely careful of turning the wheel to the left, because that would swing the mower to the right and hurt the plants. So of course what happens is by shying away from turning to the left, I'd have a bias for drifting to the right, which would require turning the wheel to the left to correct. But you wouldn't want to do that, because it would swing the mower towards the plants, so you'd hesitate, drifting farther to the right, requiring an even bigger turn to the left, which you'd want to do even less. The upshot was, if you weren't totally on top of it, making tiny little corrections immediately, anticipating what was coming up ahead, you'd quickly find yourself in a nasty feedback spiral, and before you knew it, you'd mowed down several $100s worth of plants. I learned my lesson fast. Thankfully, all it cost was some money. Let's not require such a lesson for ourselves when the cost might be our climate, our standard of living, our future. It's going to take a lot of us to give our best effort to be as thoughtful, self-critical, methodical, and generous as we ever will be at any time in our lives. But I think we can do it. We've never encountered a problem like this before, where the lag time is large, the tipping point's hidden, and the outcome global. This time, the problem is like none other, so the solution must be like none other. It's time for the best in us to come out.